Today we've got a special guest. His name is Frank Amato. He's the president and CEO of SYNAPS Dx. SYNAPS Dx has launched this breakthrough product in order to diagnose Alzheimer's early. By diagnosing Alzheimer's early, he's got the potential to impact the lives of millions of people. Looking forward today to having this conversation with Frank as we crack some of the myths regarding Alzheimer's disease and discuss the Discern diagnostic testing. Frank, welcome to the Surviving Your Brain podcast.
Philippe, thank you for having me.
In part because we've been having some amazing conversation related to Alzheimer's disease. And this conversation for me is both personal and professional. So personally, I had a grandmother who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And professionally, I see people with that diagnosis all the time. And there were things that I thought about Alzheimer's disease where I felt like I was the only one that thought this way. But in conversations with you, realizing that you think the same way too. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about your background and how you got into this business.
Sure. So I started out many years ago, really interested in the science field more than anything. And went to a school in Westchester County in Yonkers, New York, where you specialized as, in a particular area. My area was chemistry. So I was kind of in an AP chemistry program the entirety of my high school experience. And that led me into joining the military right out of high school as a medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. So I worked for probably about 8 years by the time I was, 22 years old, just largely focused on science. And I was very interested in that. I went to college after getting out of the Army, and then ended up in the pharmaceutical industry and worked for close to 25 years in pharma, largely in sales and marketing and operations functions. So really interacting with folks much like yourself, clinicians who see patients on a daily basis and are looking for solutions that are going to help them in their practice, not only diagnosing conditions, but also treating those conditions. So I've been, have dedicated the past 30 to 35 years of my life kind of working on the side of the business that helps bring solutions and products to the clinicians who need them to help patients. And that's, largely how I've spent my career.
And now you serve patients who have the potential diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And where I kind of want to start this conversation is with something that people may not realize, right? And you and I have talked about, and that is that most of the people diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease may not have Alzheimer's disease to begin with, right? And can you tell us a little bit about that? Sure.
So, again, just stepping back for a second here and thinking about kind of the historical perspective of this disease. I've been in the industry, as I mentioned, 30 to 35 years. I've worked in oncology, I've worked in dermatology, fertility, hepatitis. The one area where we've made little to no headway in the 30 years that I've been in this business is in neurodegeneration, namely Alzheimer's disease. I think it's been 25 years since we've had a new drug that's been approved that's focused on any aspect of the disease, be it the symptoms or disease modifying even. So to me, when I started to look around the industry and decide where do I want to spend the next 10 years or maybe perhaps the last 10 years of my career, I thought about, what's the one area that I could work in that might help as many people as possible. And it really struck me that in Alzheimer's disease, a clinician diagnoses a patient with dementia, and then they have to figure out what are the 20 things that could be causing this. It's a very daunting job for a doctor today to be able to have to figure that out. On top of the fact that they're required to see many patients on a daily basis, for the purposes of reimbursement and so forth. So when I had met Dr. Dan Alcon, who started his initial work at the National Institutes of Health as a program director within the neurological division there, and he dedicated his life to building and identifying biomarkers that can help diagnose the disease. And I looked at his science. I just had to be part of it. So I've been working with him and his team now for about 3 years. And our goal is to take these biomarkers that he developed in the lab and bring them to the marketplace so clinicians who see patients every day can use them to assist them in identifying whether the dementia that a patient is experiencing is actually Alzheimer's disease, or is it something else? And if it's something else, that's great. Maybe they can find out what's causing that patient's problems.
So before we move on, for people who may not know what a biomarker is, you have like just a quick, simple definition for them?
Sure. There are clues in the body that we can find to help not only diagnose a patient potentially, but also use those biomarkers to maybe find a receptor or some way to create a drug in order to help that patient with their particular issues. And we've seen that, I'll use cancer as an example. We've seen that in cancer now where they're actually personalizing the therapy and the treatment they're applying to the individual patient based on their particular diagnosis. So the biomarkers that we've developed 3. One is an imaging biomarker. We can actually take a piece of a patient's skin off of their arm, and we can assess that skin and watch how it grows in networks in a petri dish over a period of time. And we can actually determine whether or not they have Alzheimer's disease or they have a non-Alzheimer's disease dementia. We can also look for proteins in that skin, one being PKC epsilon, which is kind of a master switch or driver of synaptic growth or loss in the brain. And then lastly, we look for another protein that's kind of downstream, if you will, from PKC epsilon that look at a ratio of ERK1 and ERK2. It's really kind of an inflammatory response that's likely happening in the brain that could be causing that patient's illness. So it's not just one biomarker. We've actually put the 3 together in a way that help the clinician and ultimately drug discoverers find options that may be very helpful for the disease.
So you guys have found 3 different biomarkers. You've put them together to really see if you can get an accurate diagnosis for Alzheimer's or potentially something else that may be causing the person's dementia.
That is correct. And, each of the biomarkers independent of one another are very accurate. In fact, when we went to some of the authorities in the marketplace, such as Medicare, they asked us to put 2 of the biomarkers together. One is kind of a primary diagnostic or test, and the second as kind of a confirmatory. And if those 2 agree, you're close to 100% accuracy or 100% confidence for the physician that the condition is likely Alzheimer's disease. And then we use a third if those first 2 disagree as kind of a tiebreaker. So we've kind of built around this offering in the marketplace for a doctor and a patient almost like a foolproof way of diagnosing a disease that has really been a challenge for the marketplace up to this point.
And I think a lot of people are not aware that the way that we used to diagnose Alzheimer's in the past, it's really based on autopsy, right? So when we as clinicians are kind of making this diagnosis, ideally we're ruling everything out, but we're not 100% sure that that's what it is.
It's fascinating that you mentioned that. When I meet with investors and other strategic potential partners like diagnostic companies or pharmaceutical companies who may have an interest in our science, many times I talk about Alzheimer's disease being a diagnosis of exclusion. So you diagnose the patient with dementia as a clinician, and then all of a sudden you say, well, here's the good news. If no other symptoms show up between now and about 5 years from now, I'm pretty sure you have Alzheimer's disease, which as a family member of a potential patient or being the individual who's having that dementia crisis at that time, that probably wouldn't be received by me as really good news. So you're right. Up until this point, it's been a diagnosis of exclusion. And the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, gold standard definition for Alzheimer's disease is dementia in life, but amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tau tangles at death. So really, to your point, the only way to diagnose Alzheimer's disease up until now has been at autopsy, which is not a great way for patients thinking about what I might do as an intervention for my condition.
And as a neurologist, I've had a lot of patients that have been referred to me for Alzheimer's. And at the end of the day, their dementia was due to something else. It might have been due to vitamin deficiencies. It might have been because they're on too many medications that was impacting their thinking. It might have been that their diabetes just was way out of control. So there are a lot of things that can cause somebody to have dementia. It doesn't mean that it's going to be Alzheimer's disease. And why is it so important for us to sort of differentiate whether something is Alzheimer's disease or not Alzheimer's disease?
I think that's a great point. I mean, there have been many stories in the marketplace about people who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease who didn't have it and had Lyme's disease, as an example. And you can treat Lyme's disease for the most part with an antibiotic today. So getting that treatment is really important for those patients. But, beyond that, I think it's really critical for people who may have a variety of different conditions. It's like, I'll go back to cancer. I keep referring to cancer because I know cancer. I've worked in it for many years, but the advances we have made in the past 20 to 25 years have been incredible. And even individuals who may have breast cancer, as an example, may have a variety of different types, and you can give them different medicines as a way to treat them. And in some cases, they become a chronic condition. It's no longer a death sentence. And I think the same way for Alzheimer's disease or the variety of different causes of dementia that are out there today. Perhaps trying to find the exact patients who have Alzheimer's disease or have frontotemporal lobe dementia or have vascular dementia, if we can parse them out early and maybe have drug interventions to help them, it would be an amazing thing in my lifetime to see that happen. It's the one area, as I mentioned earlier, where we've really have had struggles trying to get there. And the population today with baby boomers, I think there's 10,000 people a day that turn 65 in this country. I mean, this condition and these issues are only going to triple in the next 20 years.
I mentioned earlier that I had a grandmother with Alzheimer's disease, or that diagnosis. And she was diagnosed with that when I was about 13, 14 years old. And up until that point, she had been the matriarch of our family. And I remember like every Saturday we would have family dinners there. And it was sort of like the highlight of the week. And then once she received that diagnosis, I just watched her sort of deteriorate. Sort of watched her just become somebody completely different. And, that was sort of my first foray into neurology. That's what got me into neurology. But as I became a neurologist and recognizing what was going on sort of in that dementia space, and a lot of people who were being diagnosed with Alzheimer's maybe didn't have it, it always brings me back to my grandmother and wondering, well, did she actually have Alzheimer's disease? And I'm not sure that she did. When I think about the lifestyle that she led, she loved her caramel little candies. I mean, she those are basically her meals, right? With like soda, thinking about, maybe she was diabetic and had uncontrolled hyperglycemia. Maybe she had vitamin deficiencies. Maybe there was something else that we could have done if the diagnosis had been accurate that could have prolonged her life, but her thinking.
It sounds like she's not the only one who loved those caramel candies, by the way. I would agree. I think that it's really devastating when a disease like this hits a family. It impacts the grandchildren, the children of the individual, the nieces and nephews who love their company, who love to spend time with them. I have my own story. My wife's aunt, who she was very close with, who helped when we had our children come watch our children for us so that my wife and I could go away for a couple of days here and there. I started to notice signs, as did her family. And, we still struggle today. What actually did she have? I mean, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's early. She had to be moved into assisted living facility and ultimately a nursing home. It's just, it just rocked the entire family. She was dangerous, especially at nighttime when she was getting up in the middle of the night and no one knew what she was doing. She was, trying to brew coffee and things like that. She could have lit the house on fire. So there was just so many different layers of suffering that everybody went through. And, even today, since the test that we've made available just recently in the marketplace wasn't available then, we're not sure ourselves. And it was very painstaking to watch my mother-in-law, especially, watch her sister kind of deteriorate like that. So I really empathize with what you must have gone through, especially at an early age with your grandmother.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about the test that you just added to the marketplace. What's the name of the test?
Sure. So we've named the test Discern. It's all about trying to understand, what's causing the condition that you may be suffering, understanding the things around you when you are suffering from the condition. So we thought Discern was the most appropriate, name for our test. It's currently being reimbursed by Medicare right now. So if you are of Medicare age, there's a good, strong likelihood that you could get your entire test paid for and taken care of by the doctor. We take a small 3 millimeter skin punch off of your arm. It's just like going in and giving blood almost. And we provide the test in the marketplace to neurologists and primary care physicians who may, have an interest in trying to diagnose the disease.
And I think people really need to sort of understand the importance of the fact that this is just a little biopsy of the skin, as opposed to having to wait until somebody's passed away and doing a brain biopsy.
Sure.
So it's a huge improvement.
Or, for many years, physicians have tried to, use a variety of different tools to help educate them or orient them as to what might be happening with the patient. They use CT scans and MRIs and PET scans where the patient has to ingest radio-labeled dye to try to find these markers in the brain that could be causing their condition. There's also lumbar punctures. So you go through a spinal tap to try to get some to your cerebral spinal fluid so they can test that. And many different things that the clinician has to put together to still subjectively diagnose the disease. We believe we can do that in a more objective way, give patients the answers potentially for their condition that they're seeking. And although the disease, Alzheimer's disease, is complex, diagnosing it doesn't have to be.
And so with Discern, how early can you pick up if somebody potentially has Alzheimer's? Do you have to wait until their dementia is really advanced, or can you pick it up in some of the earlier stages?
One of the unique things that Dr. Alcon did when he developed these biomarkers and further developed them into a test that a doctor can use is that he tried to match that NIH gold standard definition of dementia in life and plaque and tau at death. So what he did was he collected skin samples from patients in a blinded fashion and then followed these patients out until they passed away. And then they conducted the autopsies to validate the biomarkers, to really ensure that what we were doing, we could validate with an autopsy. So in doing so, I think that is a really unique way that we have developed a test in the marketplace and can assure the clinician and the patient that the diagnosis that we are helping the doctor with, because ultimately it's the doctor who makes the diagnosis, not us, ensure that they are confident that whatever they are telling the patient and the patient's family is accurate.
And do you think having an early diagnosis, does that save our healthcare system money? Does that save patients and their families money?
We had designed the test originally only for patients who had been given a dementia diagnosis by a physician. There are psychometric tests that are taken today, mini mental exams and MOCA tests. There are questionnaires that the patient fills out, and they get scored by the clinician on that test, and that then tells the doctor whether or not they have dementia. We specifically only used our test in those dementia patients initially. We are planning on doing a landmark study with a large pharmaceutical company right now and the largest retirement community in the United States in Florida currently, trying to move the test upstream into what's called mild cognitive impairment. That's before you get a dementia diagnosis, to see if we can find signal there and try to help patients with a diagnosis earlier on. We believe that earlier intervention, even lifestyle intervention like physical activity and mental exercises and diet, based on a number of studies that have been conducted by large, very reputable universities in the United States, indicate that the earlier you intervene, the slower your cognitive decline will occur. So we think that trying to get earlier and earlier, trying to get a diagnosis earlier and earlier for patients is best for everyone.
And so let's say someone you takes the Discern test, and let's say it comes back that they are at risk of Alzheimer's. Then what?
That's between the clinician and the patient. In some cases, folks will take a very rapid lifestyle change, and that may be one way to help them spend more time with their loved ones and their family. It may help them do planning. They may have been putting off a trip to Disneyland with their grandkids, or spending more time traveling out to see their children who may have moved to the opposite coast in the United States, or perhaps even overseas. There's a myriad of things I think we in life, put off for one reason or another that we may want to embark on that, give us great memories and leave our families with great memories of interacting with one another. So in an effort to do that, I think that can be very helpful. And there are also, still today, probably 175 different clinical trials that are going on that patients could perhaps embark on and maybe get into a clinical trial for a new drug that they think may be helpful with their particular condition. Again, there are some newer therapeutics that are making their way through the FDA right now. With caveats, they have to do some additional testing, et cetera, but you might be able to get access to some of those products as well.
Now, you've mentioned lifestyle a couple of different times. And one of the things that I often tell people is there are lifestyle changes that we can make every single day that are really beneficial for the brain, really good for just brain health overall. But a lot of people don't realize that. And I think it's one of the myths when it comes to something like Alzheimer's, that lifestyle has nothing to do with it. What are some myths that you see with regards to Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, so I see myths every day in the media around Alzheimer's disease, not because the media is trying to impart misinformation on the population. I think it's more around the fact that they are regurgitating information that they're getting from many of the different manufacturers out there that are developing drugs and diagnostics, many of the universities that are doing the same. I think there's such a thirst right now for trying to diagnose this disease accurately and trying to find an intervention, a therapeutic that can help people out, that many times we're hearing these, this news story that comes out that says they can find Alzheimer's disease 20 years before your first symptom occurs. And they can do that with a blood test. And they've tried it in mice and they think it works. So I think people get their hopes up that there's a blood test out there that's going to tell them what they have. And in many cases, those tests are largely just kind of a copy of what you can find perhaps with a PET scan. If they're looking for plaque and tau in your brain with a PET scan, well, maybe they can find it in your blood, and that may give the clinician and the patient some false hope. So those are some of the myths that we see on a pretty regular basis because this disease state is so terrible, meaning that there's little opportunity for it and it affects so many people around the globe that people are looking for any and all things that might be helpful. And when you see that, you'll see interventions that really scientifically may make no sense whatsoever.
Now, you sort of saying that reminds me of a patient that I saw a few years ago. She was young, probably in her 30s, and comes to me and says, I want you to do genetic testing for Alzheimer's. And so I said, well, why is that? And she had mentioned that she had a grandmother who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so I said to her, well, let's say we do this genetic testing. And let's say it comes back and says you're at risk for Alzheimer's. What are you going to do with that information? And she was like, well, there's some changes I'll start making to my life, like eating healthier, exercising, taking better care of myself. And I was like, well, shouldn't you be doing that regardless? Right? So people need to realize that, there are things that they can do every day. And just because you get a genetic test or a blood test that's trying to predict where you're going to be 20 years out, that doesn't mean that you have to get there. Genetics does not always equal destiny. And one of the things that I see when it comes to myths, a lot of people don't even realize that something like depression can mask itself as dementia. And that makes me remember a family that came to see me. And the husband and wife come with his mother, who for the last 6 months had been experiencing some kind of cognitive decline. And they were concerned that she had Alzheimer's. And so I said to them, well, what happened 6 months ago? They were like, well, 6 months ago, she was living in her country. She was doing great. We brought her here to the United States so she can take care of our children. So she spends all day with our children. And then on Saturdays, we take her out. And I was like, well, most people take their dogs out twice a day. You're only taking her out on Saturday. And you took this woman out of her country where she had a life. She had a garden. She had friends. She had a community to support her. That this was not necessarily dementia, certainly not Alzheimer's, but this was depression masking itself. And so I think, combating some of the myths we see about Alzheimer's is incredibly important.
Yeah, that story really resonates with me. I worked with a founder for a company that I have been involved with, and he's of Italian descent. And he would talk all the time about how important it is every day for you to leave your house and walk down to the park or to the center of your community and spend time with people and maybe play some chess or checkers or bocce ball, whatever it is that goes on in that center, interact with your peers and have a nice lunch, make sure there's a little red wine involved from his perspective. And then walk back up to your home and get even a little bit of exercise every day. And that interaction and that connection to people in his mind was really important to keep your faculties about you, as he would say. I've also, will note that, that retirement community that I mentioned earlier, the Villages down in Florida, I happen to spend a fair amount of time down there. They have 150,000 people that are 55 years and older. The one thing that shocked me, actually the two things that shocked me when I was down there was, number one, they have 300 softball teams down in that community, and some of the people are in their 80s and still playing softball. I thought that was fascinating. But the other thing that really fascinated me was no one is allowed in that entire community of tens of thousands of homes to have their own mailbox. Everybody's required to go down to the town center to pick up their mail every day. And it forces you to interact with each other, forces you to get out of the house. It forces you to run into your neighbors like we did when we were younger and invite people over for a piece of pie or some coffee. And we don't see that as much anymore. It's become more and more of a digital world, even as elderly folks. My parents, thankfully, are still alive, but my mom spends more time on Facebook, and which is really surprising because when she was born, the handheld computer wasn't, calculator wasn't invented yet. So it's really fascinating. So getting out, spending time with others, interacting can have a profound impact, I think, at least what I've read in the literature on, preserving your cognitive abilities, I think. So to that point, it doesn't surprise me that there are a number of different conditions that could mask or even mimic what could be dementia. And that could be caused by a myriad of things, most notably interacting with others, family, friends, etc. So I think that's vitally important.
Well, my mom the other day said to me, "Oh, did you see Facebook?" I'm like, "No." She's like, "Oh, I posted a picture of you this morning on Facebook." I was like, "Okay." She was like, "Go take a look at it." I'm like, "Oh, Mom, I don't see it." And she's like, "Do you know you have 2 Facebook profiles? It's on the other one." I'm like, "Oh my God, how much time are you spending on Facebook?" But to your point about connection, right? One of the things I always tell people is that what makes neurons, the nerve cells in the brain, so incredibly important is that they are built specifically for communication with each other. And every neurological disease, every brain disease in some shape or form is due to a breakdown in communication amongst neurons. And we see the same thing happen with people. Right? When there's a breakdown in communication between couples, that's when separation and divorce happens. Breakdown in communication between countries, that's when war happens. And so one of the things that I tell people is that you need to start acting more like neurons and connect and communicate, because it is so vitally important for our brain function.
I couldn't agree more. You know, our initial or primary biomarker, it's called the morphometric imaging assay biomarker. We look at how the skin grows over about a 6-week period of time. And to your point, we get the skin sample in first, and it's got some debris on it, right? It's got some, keratinocytes and different, cell structures that we have to wash away from there, because we really want to get to the fibroblast. Because if you can get to the fibroblast, that fibroblast will begin to really network, aggregate, connect with each other, just like the neurons in the brain do. And that's why our science, to me, is very fascinating. Dr. Alcon figured that out some 30 years ago and set out to kind of prove that. And in that interaction, and what we see with an Alzheimer's patient's skin cells that network and grow together versus a non-Alzheimer's disease dementia patient is vastly different. The connections, the interactions, the networking of the non-Alzheimer's disease patient is fascinating. You can see it, that you see far more cells under that microscopic, view or image that we see there. Whereas in the Alzheimer's disease patient, we see dark, clumping, few, less aggregated cells. So even in the Alzheimer's disease patient who are obviously having a issue with their brain, we see that even in the peripheral aspects of the body. It's a systemic disease. It even occurs in how your skin grows together. So it's a fascinating point you make there, and one I absolutely agree with.
And one of the things I always tell people is that we are far too specialized in medicine. Usually a disease that is impacting one part of the body is impacting the entire body. It's literally one brain and one body. And what you see in one place, you see it in another place. So the work that Dr. Alcon has done has been absolutely amazing. If you've got somebody who might be concerned that they can develop Alzheimer's in the future, what are 3 or 4 lifestyle things that you would tell them they can start doing today that would help with that, minimize their risk of developing Alzheimer's?
Yeah, there are several studies out there, the finger study, the pointer study. I think, if I remember correctly, Wake Forest was one of the universities that jumped out into this thought process very early on. They looked at 10,000 people in a study, and they found that those who even do things like, crossword puzzles and Sudoku and really today Wordle, for those of you who do Wordle out there, or Quirtle for that matter. But the point being is that mental exercises, using your brain to kind of think through tasks on a daily basis and spend the time to do that. Force yourself to actually do that on a daily basis. I remember when I was a kid, my grandparents and my parents would make me go down to the corner store and get the newspaper. And right away they'd go to the Jumble and the crossword and all the things that they try to participate activity-wise in. But that has been one of the things that's come out of this data that indicate that is very helpful for you to continue to exercise your brain. Physical activity, the idea of leaving your house and walking to the town center or walking down the hill and back up the hill every day to get the newspaper, or when we were kids to get groceries. My mother never had a driver's license. She either jumped on the subway or jumped on the city bus to get around. We had one car in the family. My mother walked several blocks to get groceries. Today, we just hit an app and it shows up on our doorstep. So getting out and having some physical activity, I think, is really important. And then lastly, without question, having a good balanced diet. And I'll be the first one to tell you that that's not me typically. I probably eat too much pasta and enjoy, a good sandwich with bread almost on a daily basis. But that said, there's no question that looking after your sugar in your blood and your lipids and all the things that we tend to go to the doctor to take medicine for, trying to lower those and eat right is probably one of the key things we've seen in the literature out there today.
Well, I had the privilege of visiting the lab, the SYNAPS lab, last week. And we had a really good meal for dinner.
Yes, we did.
I'm not sure how healthy it was, but it was
Right.
a very, very good meal. Some of you might be hearing us talk about dementia and Alzheimer's and thinking that we're sort of using them one and the same, but we're not. Dementia is sort of the bigger umbrella, and Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. And this is something you and I talk about often, is that people, and not just sort of your lay people who are not in medicine, but healthcare providers often confuse this. And that's part of the problem.
It is. I think there's a lot of confusion out there. We will, in some cases, speak to physicians at insurance companies who are chief medical officers and medical directors. We have had conversations with folks at CMS and at FDA who are PhDs and MDs by training. But unlike yourself, Philippe, if you're not steeped in the neurologic conditions out there and really understand the disease state, they oftentimes interchange dementia and Alzheimer's as being the same thing, which is not always the case. You can have dementia, but not have Alzheimer's disease. In fact, about 35 to 40% of the people who get a dementia diagnosis have a dementia that is being caused by something other than Alzheimer's disease. However, if you have Alzheimer's disease, then you clearly have dementia. And I think that's the difference. To your point, the umbrella is dementia. All the different things under that umbrella that could cause dementia, and there's probably 20 plus things out there, are individual diseases that lead to or are the cause of that dementia that the patient is experiencing. And dementia is largely cognitive loss, right? That could manifest itself in your personality changing and your ability to think through simple tasks, and or your reasoning, your executive reasoning on any one of a number of different topics that we deal with on a daily basis.
So let's say if somebody is starting to have some issues with thinking or memory or even personality. So how do they find you? How do they find SYNAPS? And even more importantly, how do they get the Discern test?
Sure. The best way to find us is www.synapsdx.com. On the website there, it has everything you will need to know, in our opinion, about a dementia and or Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. There'll be additional materials there for you to utilize. We may even be able to direct you in your area to a doctor who could be helpful for you. And also you can give that information to the doctor for your parent or your grandparent, or even for yourself if you want them to learn about our test. It's very simple to get our test. The physician just has to fill out a quick, takes a minute to fill out the form. It's a patient requisition form. We send them a kit to their practice, everything they'll need to know to take that little piece of skin off your arm, send the skin back to us overnight, and then we'll process that over probably about an 8 to 10 week period. The skin takes about 6 weeks to grow. If you're an Alzheimer's disease patient, as I referenced earlier, it takes a little longer for your skin to grow. So could be a little longer in that case. So maybe 10 weeks for us to get the results back to a doctor. But that's largely how you can get access to what it is we're doing down here in the Bethesda, Maryland area.
Well, the work that you guys are doing at SYNAPS Dx is amazing. You know that I am a big, big fan. I think you're going to have a positive impact on the lives of just millions of people and their families. So Frank, I want to really thank you for being here today and joining me in this conversation.
My pleasure, Philippe. And I really appreciate all the work you're doing to get the word out to people on a myriad of topics centered around the brain. There's so much here that people can learn from, and I really applaud your efforts. And I'm glad you're taking the time to learn about what we're doing as well, because you've been a real advocate for us. So thank you.
Thank you. And guys, you've been watching another episode of the Surviving Your Brain podcast. Looking forward to seeing you next time.